Every morning he tied shut the barn door with a piece of rope no one had touched but him. Until one day, a woman with stitched cloth from his past walked that red dirt trail, 3 quiet kids behind her, no suitcase, no words. He didn't ask why, he just left the door unknotted the next morning, and in Dry Creek, Texas, that's how it begins. Part 1. Smoke on the High Ground. The fire was already snapping when the first streaks of day broke across the hills beyond Dry Creek. A sharp wind blew through the juniper scrub, scraping against warped fence posts and the crooked bones of what used to be a corral. Bo Carter stood over the fire pit behind his cabin, one boot braced on the flat rock where he always stood. Like ritual, the flame licked around mesquite logs and the metal percolator hissed faintly. One dented tin cup waited on the stump beside him. He didn't need 2 anymore. Bo hadn't spoken aloud in weeks, not unless you counted the grunted remarks he gave the blind mare or the old dog when they strayed too close to the cattle fence. The dog, Whiskey, had stopped expecting anything beyond routine. He would come and go, flopping in the shade during hot hours, rising only when Bo moved towards the barn or the gate. The mare, dusty and glass-eyed on the left, still whinnied when she heard the feed bucket rattle, but never came too fast. She, like the man who fed her, had learned not to hurry toward things that wouldn't stay. The wind shifted again, bringing with it a scent Bo knew too well, dry cedar smoke from some distant rancher's hearth, mixed with that late winter sour of soil not yet ready to be plowed. He poured the coffee slowly, careful not to spill. The steam curled toward his face, and he let it rise without moving, without sipping. There had been a time. He recalled it in the way a man might feel the ache of an old scar, when 2 cups were poured each morning, not just one. When the fire was built not just for warmth, but to keep something soft alive between them. That time had faded like saddle leather left too long in the sun. He turned and looked toward the slope behind the barn. A twisted old oak clung there, black roots curling around shale like arthritic hands. She'd loved that tree, said it reminded her of their first place together, the one with the creek and the porch that groaned under summer heat. The porch was gone now. Storms had taken it, plank by plank, like grief working slowly. But the tree remained. And under it, where shadows fell the longest in the afternoons, Bo had buried something. Wrapped in old cloth and tied with twine, the letter stayed beneath a small cairn of stones he never disturbed. It didn't have a name on it, just words never sent. Words that had burned too late to matter but still needed writing. That morning he walked up the rise, steam still rising from the cup in his hand, and knelt there. The dog followed, then sat beside him, ears pricked. Bo didn't pray, didn't speak, just sat still while the wind passed over the hilltop like an old song hummed by someone long gone. Below them the land stretched in all directions. Patches of winter-yellowed grass held on between gullies. Fence lines sagged, needing mending. Dry Creek shimmered faintly in the distance, a quiet scar in the earth, barely alive. It had been months since he rode into town, even longer since anyone rode out to him. They all knew the shape of the man he'd become. They respected it the way you respect an open grave. Give it space, nod if you pass, but don't ask what's inside. The days passed like that, one folded into the next. He kept the barn swept, the tack clean, the stock fed, not because anyone would see, but because he still believed in order, even if the only soul left to witness it was blind in one eye and didn't know. Tuesday from Sunday. When the sun reached above the hill, Bo rose, tapped the side of the tin cup with his thumb, drank the last of it cold. By the time he walked back toward the barn, the wind had changed again, and somewhere in that wind, just for a flicker, he thought he caught the scent of lavender. But maybe it was memory playing tricks again. The mind, when left to its own for too long, starts whispering things it shouldn't. Still, he paused at the barn door, hand on the frayed rope he used to keep it shut. He stood there for a long while, listening. Not for sounds, but for silence shaped different than usual. Like something had moved softly beneath the ordinary hush. Then, without knowing why, he undid the knot and left the door unlatched. Just that once. Part 2. The Woman on the Trail. The general store in Dry Creek was little more than a squared-off shack of whitewashed boards and sunburnt roof shingles, but folks came when they needed flour, rope, or tobacco, and sometimes when they didn't need anything but to be seen, to remind themselves they still had a place among the living. That morning the trail dust hadn't settled yet when Nora Whitlow stepped up onto the warped wooden stoop with her 3 children close as shadows. The oldest, Eli, walked behind her with the solemnity of someone twice his age. The girl, Clara, barely taller than a saddle horn, clung to her mother's dress, and the baby, quiet, swaddled against her chest, never made a sound. The wind carried grit that bit at the eyes, but Nora didn't blink. Her face was sun-marked and drawn at the cheeks, the kind of lean you don't get from fasting by choice. But she stood straight, even when she stepped aside for 2 men hauling barrels, and kept one hand firm on her daughter's shoulder, like an anchor in shallow water. Inside, the storekeeper looked up with a polite tilt of the head, recognition, not welcome. Folks in Dry Creek had long memories, and it didn't take much for a woman with 3 children and no ring to draw quiet judgment. But Nora didn't speak to the storekeeper. She spoke to Bo Carter. He hadn't noticed her come in, not right away. He was halfway through checking the weight on a grain sack, his back turned, collar up against the wind that had followed him indoors, when she said, "I heard you might need help cleaning the barn." It was quiet, almost not a question. He turned slow. His eyes, the color of sun-scorched clay, rested on hers for a second, then fell to the children. He noticed the boy first, hands clenched, jaw set like someone prepared to take a hit and not flinch. The girl peered up at him, unsure but unafraid, and then his gaze landed on something small, something that made his shoulders still. Tied around the youngest child's wrist was a scrap of fabric, nothing special to most eyes, just a strip of old embroidery, the kind folks in these parts passed down or patched into quilts. But Bo knew that pattern, knew it the way you know the shape of a scar beneath a sleeve. It was the same as the one wrapped around the letter buried beneath the oak on his hill. Red thread, blue stars, stitched into faded ivory. His wife's fingers had worked those patterns once, humming softly, her hands warmed by lamplight. He didn't speak of it, didn't ask. Just looked at the cloth for a long breath, then back at Nora. She didn't explain, didn't apologize. Her gaze didn't beg, but it held. He looked down again at the grain sack, nudged it with his boot. "Tomorrow," he said after a pause thick as molasses, "before sunrise." Nothing more, no instructions, no promises, just space. Outside, as they turned to leave, the girl stumbled on the step. Nora caught her and murmured something soft. Bo watched the wind pick up her hair and toss it briefly across her face, and in that moment she looked exactly like someone who'd never expected anything kind from a stranger again. He didn't follow them, didn't offer a hand or a ride. But that night, back on his land, he fed the fire longer than usual, left the barn door untied again, and before sleep he turned over the stone at the foot of the oak, not to dig, just to touch it. The embroidered cloth still wrapped the letter, dry beneath the earth. Part 3. Brooms and Silence. The next morning broke slow and colorless. No sun yet, just a faint silvery sheen on the far horizon and the hush of mesquite shadows stretching across a hard-packed dirt. Bo Carter had already been up an hour, fire going, tin kettle hissing atop the stove. He poured 1 cup of coffee, set it on the table, poured a second out of habit, and then, without a word, poured that second cup back into the pot. It wasn't time for ghosts, not today. He stepped out, the cold nipping at his boots, and crossed the yard to the barn. It still smelled of old hay, dry leather, and time left behind. A few loose boards rattled when the wind hit right. He didn't fix them. Instead, he leaned against the rail just outside the door, waiting, not like a man expecting anything grand, just like one who'd said he would and meant it. They arrived not long after, Nora and the children. She walked ahead, her shoulders tight beneath a borrowed shawl. Eli followed with a small satchel of supplies. Clara and the baby stuck close, quiet but watchful. No greetings, no explanations. She gave Bo a short nod, like they'd struck a business deal in a different life. Bo stepped back without a word and let them pass. Nora got to work. It was the kind of labor nobody wanted. Scrubbing old feed troughs crusted with dust and insect shells, brushing down spider-hung beams, piling hay that had sat too long in corners left for mice. But she didn't flinch, didn't mutter or sigh. She moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd had to fix too much with too little for too long. The children didn't touch anything. They sat near the threshold on a folded tarp, eyes low, legs tucked beneath them. Eli stole glances at Bo every so often, but said nothing. The little girl traced shapes in the dirt with her finger. Stars, maybe, or nothing at all. Bo stayed nearby, not helping, not overseeing, just present. When Nora lifted the saddle off its hook to sweep beneath it, Bo reached up and steadied it with one hand. She didn't thank him, just kept working. The only real sound in the barn was the swish of the broom and the occasional creak of the rafters when the wind stirred. By noon, the place had begun to look different, not new but less forgotten. And just before she left, Nora walked to the far stall, the one his old gelding had died in years back, and tied something small to the center post, a leather pouch worn at the edges, the kind used for dried herbs or old coins. A few sprigs of sage poked from the top, bound with red thread. Bo stared at it after she'd gone, hand resting on the stall gate. Some would have called it superstition, but not him. Not after what he'd seen in this land. That pouch was a gesture, maybe for luck, maybe to ward off whatever sorrow lingered in the bones of this barn. Maybe both. That night, when the wind turned sharp and dry again, Bo came out with a lantern. He stood at the barn's threshold a long time, watching the empty stalls, the neatly stacked hay, the patch of swept floor beneath the saddle. Then he reached up and unlatched the rusted chain that had long held the big wooden doors shut. He didn't toss the chain away, just coiled it and laid it down gently by the wall, like something no longer needed, but not quite ready to be buried. Inside, the leather pouch still hung, swaying lightly in the breeze, and the barn, for the first time in a long while, smelled not just of dust, but of sage. Part 4. A door unlatched. The rain didn't announce itself with thunder, just a slow hush rolling in from the west, the kind that settled low and thick like a long-held breath. First it darkened the far hills, then it crept across the plains, washing over, mesquite and barbed wire until the sound of it filled everything, steady, drumming, soft. Bo Carter stood under the porch awning, sleeves rolled to the elbows, a half-split log hanging from his hand. He hadn't seen the woman or her children since morning, and they were late. He didn't pace. Bo wasn't the pacing kind. He just looked out toward the road, where the old wagon tracks vanished into rain fog. The rope he always used to knot the barn door hung loose now, damp from the drizzle. It hadn't been tied since yesterday. He carried the log inside, fed it to the stove, and moved with quiet purpose. Not fast, not slow, just enough. The guest cabin sat off to the side of the main house, across a patch of wet earth that used to grow corn, back before the sickness took more than just crops. Nobody had used the cabin in years. Dust had settled in the corners, cobwebs curled beneath the eaves, but the roof still held and the chimney still drew. Bo lit a fire in the old iron stove. It smoked a little at first, then caught. He laid out 3 clean blankets across the bed, blue ones from the trunk at the foot of his own bed, folded years ago by a woman who hadn't thought she was folding them for strangers. Then he took off his coat, weathered canvas, wool-lined, and draped it across the back of the chair near the stove. It still smelled faintly of smoke and leather and time. On the small table, he left a basin of water and a cloth. On the stove, a pot of stew, slow-cooked with salt pork and beans, still warm from earlier. There were no notes, no instructions, just space. Space that hadn't been opened in a long while, but was ready now, in case someone needed it. Then he returned to the porch and waited. It was nearly dark when they arrived. He didn't hear them at first. Just the faint thud of boots in mud, the creak of worn leather. The boy appeared first, rain-soaked and cautious. Behind him, the little girl carried her younger sister, wrapped in a coat far too large. Nora came last, her dress plastered to her legs, a shawl pulled tight over her head, heavy with water. She saw the glow through the cabin window before she saw him. Bo didn't speak, just motioned with his chin toward the door. Then he turned and went inside his house, shutting the door without sound. Nora hesitated only a moment, then she led the children inside. The warmth met them like a memory, a fire already going, blankets that didn't need asking for, a coat near the door, worn but dry, stew that smelled like home should have smelled. She didn't cry. Nora hadn't cried in months. She just placed the baby down gently, unwound the girl's soaked scarf, and fed them both small spoonfuls of broth, while steam curled around her cheeks. A while later, the cabin door creaked open. Bo stood in the doorway, rain dripping from the brim of his hat, but his face calm, unreadable. He looked toward the stove. "Still hot," he said, "just that, not pity, not charity. Just a man who had made space, and a woman who had walked through a door someone had finally remembered to leave open." Outside, the rain softened. Inside, the silence changed. It wasn't cold anymore. Part 5. Teaching the boy to saw. The morning after the rain, the sky over Dry Creek held the kind of quiet that made you think something was deciding whether to stay or leave. The sun rose slowly, brushing color into the clouds, but the ground still held yesterday's wetness, like it hadn't quite let go of the storm. Bo Carter didn't knock on the guest cabin door. He never had much use for knocking. Instead, he set a half-dozen boards on the sawhorse near the barn, laid out a handsaw beside them, and began measuring with a worn strip of rawhide he'd used since his father's time. He started sawing slowly, purposeful, letting the rhythm carry through the still air, back and forth, smooth and even, like breath. A while later, the sound of the cabin door opening reached him, then the soft patter of footsteps. It wasn't the woman this time, it was the boy. Eli, maybe 8 or 9, maybe older. It was hard to tell with children who'd grown up knowing what silence was before they ever knew what comfort could be. He didn't say anything, just stood there in oversized boots, arms folded like he wasn't sure what he was doing there, but also wasn't about to leave. Bo didn't greet him, just offered the saw by laying it across the next plank. Eli didn't move. Bo took another stroke. Wood shavings curled and dropped to the ground like feathers. Another pause. Then the boy stepped closer, picked up the saw with both hands, awkward at first, and looked up once to see if he was allowed. Bo didn't nod. Didn't need to. They cut the next board together side by side. Eli struggled at first. The teeth bit at the wrong angle. The rhythm jolted. The blade stuck. But Bo didn't correct him with words. He adjusted the boy's grip gently, one large hand over small fingers, then stepped back. The boy tried again. Better this time. By the third board, they didn't need to look at each other. By the fifth, Eli was humming, just barely. A low thread of sound like a boy forgetting to be afraid. When the sun touched high noon, Bo stopped. He handed the boy half a biscuit from his coat pocket, the kind with too much molasses and not enough flour. Eli took it like it was a treasure. Then, with great care, the boy reached into the pocket of his worn coat and pulled out something wrapped in a scrap of cloth. A small stone. Flat. Smoothed by time and wind. Scratched into its surface, crude and careful, was the letter B. Bo held it in his hand. Turned it once. Eli looked away like maybe he shouldn't have offered it, but Bo slipped the stone into his own coat pocket and didn't say a word. That afternoon, the boy didn't go back to the cabin right away. He stayed near the barn, dragging a stick in the mud, whittling his own version of something out of scrap pine. Bo went inside, poured a second cup of coffee, and left it on the table across from his own. Didn't touch it. Just let it steam. For a man like Bo Carter, teaching a boy to saw wood wasn't about lumber, and for a boy like Eli, offering a stone with a single letter wasn't about spelling. It was about testing the air. And finding, for once, it didn't push back. Part 6. Martha and the Whispered Questions. The first time Martha Tisdale saw Bo Carter after the burial, she'd said nothing. Just left a loaf of bread wrapped in wax paper on the porch rail and walked off before the dog could bark. Since then, 5 years had gone by. And yet, this morning, her buggy creaked down the dirt lane toward his fence, like no time had passed at all. She didn't knock either, just stepped down, brushed flour dust from her skirt, and stared at the house like it might vanish if she blinked. The yard was cleaner than she remembered. Firewood stacked, a child's boot print in the mud, and the faint scent of rosemary and burnt hay drifting from the barn. Inside, the air was warm from the stove. Someone had swept recently, and on the side table near the hearth, set neatly beside a tin coffee pot, was a porcelain cup, chipped at the rim, hairline cracked down the middle, but she knew that cup. Knew it like a hymn she hadn't sung in years. Bo stood near the window, arms crossed, eyes on the field, but not seeing it. He didn't flinch when she spoke. She was always careful with it, Martha said gently, even when her hands shook. Bo turned his head slightly, said nothing. She sat down. Didn't ask, just reached into the basket she brought and pulled out a small round of sourdough still warm. He sliced it in half, handed her the bigger piece. Neither of them mentioned it. Outside, a child's laugh rang out once, then vanished quickly like it wasn't meant to be heard. Martha waited until her last bite to speak again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried something weightier than bread. You planning on keeping them? Bo's knife scraped against the plate. He didn't look at her, didn't answer either. But he reached for the cup, the chipped one, held it steady for a moment, then placed it exactly where it used to sit. Right side of the stove, edge just touching the curtain shadow, where she had always set it, where no one else had dared touch it since. Martha watched him. She didn't press, just stood, adjusted her shawl, and took a long, slow breath of wood smoke and rosemary. As she walked to the door, she paused, hand on the frame, and glanced back. You know, Bo, there's more kinds of keeping than just keeping close. He didn't reply, didn't need to. The sound of a child sweeping the porch drifted in. A rhythm. Not perfect, but steady. Martha stepped outside and let the screen door shut behind her on its own. She didn't look back, but she smiled when she saw the faint trace of a child's drawing in the dust by the porch step. A crooked heart, two stick figures holding hands, and what might have been a horse with 3 legs. Back in town, nobody asked why she'd taken the long route home. But later that week, folks noticed she'd baked more than usual. 3 extra loaves, 2 pies, and 1 small dish of baked apples set aside on her windowsill, wrapped in cloth, embroidered with a faded blue thread. Part 7. The Man Who Left. It was a dusty afternoon when Rhett Sawyer rode into Dry Creek. He came the way trouble often did, slow, smiling, and carrying more swagger than sense. The kind of man who smelled like horse sweat and old whiskey, who called every stranger friend, but never stayed long enough to mean it. Bo heard the hoofbeats long before they reached the gate. It wasn't the rhythm that warned him, but the way the dog, Whiskey, stopped chewing his bone and went stiff by the step, tail flat, ears back. Bo stepped off the porch, wiped his hands on his trousers, and didn't bother to fetch his hat. The man at the gate leaned forward in the saddle, one hand resting casual on the horn. Dust clung to his boots like old debt, and his eyes were too pale to trust. "Evenin'," Rhett drawled, voice too smooth, too easy. Bo didn't reply. Rhett shifted, eyed the porch, the window, the curtain that barely moved. His smile thinned. "Come to fetch my family," he said. The words hung there like smoke after gunpowder, hollow, sharp, lingering. Bo didn't move, didn't blink, just placed his hand on the porch post, the wood warm from the sun, and let the silence stretch between them. Rhett chuckled low. "Don't need no scene, just figured they'd be ready to go is all." Bo shifted only once, reached slowly down and tightened the reins on the mare tied near the fence. Not fast, not threatening, just sure. It was the first time he'd done that in years. Rhett noticed. His jaw worked, chewing something invisible. He spit into the dirt and kicked his horse forward a step. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." A gust of wind blew dust across the yard, scattering dry mesquite leaves between them. Inside the house, a small face peered between the curtain folds, then vanished quickly as it came. Bo's voice came low, even, like water finding its way through stone. "They ain't ready," Rhett frowned. "They're mine." Bo nodded once. "Used to be." For a long moment, nothing moved. Not the wind, not the horse, not the man. Then the screen door creaked open behind Bo. Nora's voice came quiet, but steady. "They've already eaten." Rhett shifted in the saddle, glanced past Bo toward the porch. "You gonna let her talk for you now?" Bo didn't answer, didn't have to, because that old rope he used to knot the barn shut, he'd tied it differently these days, not as a lock, but as a signal, loose enough to open, but only from one side. Rhett leaned back, clicked his tongue, and turned the horse without another word, but not before tossing one last look over his shoulder. "I'll be back." The words weren't a threat. They were a habit, the kind men like him repeated, and never meant to follow through. Bo didn't watch him go, just untied the reins and walked the mare around the side of the house, gave her a rub behind the ears, whispered something only she heard. Later that night, when the wind picked up and the lanterns burned low, Bo took a chair to the porch, sat with his coffee, and listened, not for danger, but for the sound of children breathing through open windows, like a man who'd once known peace and was learning again how it sounded. Part 8. The Scarf and the Nod. Night settled quiet and slow across Dry Creek, one of those windless evenings where even the owls held their breath. Inside the ranch house, supper had come and gone, with the usual quiet clatter of spoons and the rustle of small shoulders settling into blankets. The scent of bean stew lingered, mixed with the faint smoke of mesquite wood still smoldering in the stove. Bo Carter washed the tin bowls at the basin, his sleeves rolled and damp, the rhythm of the water a steady beat against the hush. Nora hadn't said much since Rhett's visit. No worry, no questions. But her hands had moved with purpose through the kitchen, and her eyes kept glancing out the window as though measuring the weight of the shadows. When Bo dried the last plate, he noticed something folded and laid carefully at the end of the table. A scarf. Old, faded. The same embroidery he'd seen on the strip of cloth around the little girl's wrist, and on the twine-wrapped letter he'd buried beneath the gnarled tree. Soft stitches in the shape of prairie flowers, worn thread by worn thread. Not fine work, but sincere, the kind of cloth passed from hand to hand when words fell short. Bo turned to look out the window. There she stood, Nora, on the edge of the porch, arms crossed, not for warmth, but for stillness, like a woman bracing herself against something long expected. Her eyes met his, and she nodded just once. It wasn't a plea, it wasn't a thank you. It was something quieter, stronger, and understanding. "I'm not going with him," she said, her voice barely more than breath, "but I won't stop him if he tries." She didn't say Rhett's name, didn't need to, neither did Bo. There are moments in a man's life when no one speaks, but everything is said. Moments when someone else's courage passes through the bones of your own ribs, and you find yourself standing a little straighter without knowing why. Bo didn't move, just nodded back. Not a promise, not a plan, but something just as steady. That night he stepped out to the barn before turning in, checked the stalls, laid an extra blanket over the dog, then stood for a long while at the back door of the house. He looked out toward the road Rhett had ridden in on. Dust long settled, only stars above it now. He ran a calloused thumb over the edge of the scarf she'd left. A man could ignore a lot of things in his life, but not a gesture like that. Part 9. A Crack and a Wooden Spear. By the third morning the scent of unease hung thicker than the coming rain. The wind had shifted. It always did before. Trouble. Out near the fence line, Whiskey the dog paced slow circles, his ears half-cocked, body low, not barking, just listening. The kind of listening only old dogs know. Bo Carter noticed, and he didn't ask the wind for answers. It was giving them already. That day passed quiet, too quiet. Even the children, usually bunched on the porch with worn slates and broken pencils, stayed inside. Nora moved through the kitchen like she had one foot still packed and the other waiting for a reason not to run. Come dusk, the sky burned low, orange and bruised, when the hooves came. Not one this time. 3. Bo was at the woodpile when he heard them. He didn't rush, just set down the axe and wiped his palms on his pant leg. Rhett Sawyer led the trio, swagger in the saddle like it was stitched into his bones. The two men behind him weren't locals. One wore a hat too fine for this side of Texas. The other chewed a matchstick like he thought it made him look dangerous. They didn't ride to the porch. They veered toward the barn. Bo stepped forward. He didn't carry a rifle, didn't bring a pistol, just a stick of old cedar, weathered, cracked. Once, long ago, it had been a child's toy, a spear whittled down by hands that had never held a gun, carved with the kind of care a boy gives when pretending to be brave. Bo's son had made it, years back, before the sickness, before the grave. Bo had found it again in the loft last winter, almost thrown it into the stove, but his hand stopped for reasons he couldn't name. He sanded it instead, oiled the shaft, carried it out now across the yard. The 3 riders were at the barn gate. Rhett's mouth opened to speak, but Bo said nothing. He walked past them, slow, and drove the wooden spear into the ground, deep and straight, right between the barn and the men. Didn't raise his voice, didn't square his shoulders like he meant to fight. He just looked Rhett in the eye and said, "If you're set on crossing this line, go ahead." It wasn't a challenge, it was a memory, planted deep as fence posts, the kind of line men don't step over, not because they fear pain, but because somewhere in their bones they know it's wrong. Rhett's face shifted. Not quite a smirk now. Not quite sure. "You think you can stop me with a stick, Carter?" one of the hired men said, hand brushing his coat like iron lived beneath it. But Bo didn't flinch. "I'm not stopping you," he said. "I'm showing you where I stand." Behind him, a soft noise. A window pushed open. A breath held. Nora stood at the edge of the house's shadow, one hand at her side, one behind her back. Not afraid, not proud, just ready. The spear didn't sway. Wind had left the evening still. The dog growled once. That was all. No gunfire, no fists, just the tension of three horses shifting weight, unsure if their riders should lead or leave. Then one of the strangers chuckled. "Ain't worth the cattle," he muttered, turning his horse. The other followed. Rhett sat a beat longer, eyes unreadable. Then he tugged the reins with a grunt and spat into the dirt. "You always were stubborn, Carter." And with that, he left again. But this time, the dust behind him didn't carry promise, just retreat. Bo didn't move until the sound of hooves faded. Then he reached out, plucked the wooden spear from the soil, and leaned it against the barn wall, like a memory set down, but not forgotten. Inside, through the half-open door, Nora exhaled softly, the kind of breath a woman lets go of when something heavy has finally shifted, even if only a little. Part 10, Gunshot and Grit. By morning, the wind had shifted again, the kind of shift you don't hear so much as feel, like the land itself was waiting, watching, holding breath. Bo Carter went about chores like always. Feed the mare, boil the coffee, wipe down the porch rail just to watch the dust settle again. But the barn door stayed open that day, and the wooden spear rested where he'd left it, still upright, still silent, a marker now. Inside the house, Nora moved quieter than usual. Not from fear, not quite. More like bracing for a storm she wasn't sure would pass. The children felt it too. Eli sat by the fire with his hands still, eyes never leaving the window. The girls, once drawn to corners and shadow, stayed close to Nora's hem, not asking, not crying, just there. By noon, the sun burned high and mean. Dust lifted easy from the trail like ash from a dying fire, and sure enough, the hooves came back. But slower this time. Measured Rhett Sawyer again, alone. He wasn't smiling now. His mouth held something sharper than swagger, like a man who didn't get what he thought he was owed. He dismounted near the corral, didn't bother to tie the reins, just stepped forward, boots kicking up that stubborn yellow dust, and called toward the porch. "Nora!" She didn't answer, she didn't move, but Bo did. He stepped out, coat open, no hat, just the lines of the sun worn deep into his face. No gun. Still no gun. Only that same calm way he looked at land, at weather, at men who talked louder than they stood. Rhett's hand dropped to his belt. Not fast, not yet, just resting. "You really think she and them kids belong here, with you?" he asked, tone low but bitter. Bo didn't speak, just stood there, the way an old gate stands, not wide open, but not locked either. Then Rhett's voice turned meaner. "You ain't even got the guts to—" "Ah!" Crack. The sound came not from Bo, but from behind, from the road, from a woman's hand. Martha, standing square in the dust, bonnet flapping behind her like a banner of pure steel resolve, eyes locked on Rhett's back. In her hand, her mother's old derringer, tiny thing, barely a threat by measure, but held firm. "Don't finish that sentence," she said. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Rhett froze. That's the thing about a real warning. It don't ask for permission. Martha didn't flinch, didn't blink. She didn't aim like she was bluffing. She aimed like a woman who'd buried good friends, baked bread for grieving widows, and had enough of men who thought the world owed them. "You come back here again," she said. "I won't miss next time." Rhett didn't spit this time. He didn't cuss. He just turned, slow, climbed on his horse like a man who knew the trail behind him was longer than the one ahead, and rode. No backward glance, just the sound of hoofbeats fading into scrub and heat. Martha lowered the pistol, eyes never leaving until the dust settled. Then she looked at Bo and nodded once before walking off again. No explanation, no praise, just a neighbor doing what needed done. Inside, the girls peered through the curtain. Eli stepped out onto the porch, close enough for Bo to hear him breathing. Bo didn't say anything. He just walked to the barn, ran his hand once along the cedar spear, then picked it up and leaned it inside the doorway. There was nothing left to guard. That night, the storm came late. Soft rain, not hard, no wind, just a steady hum against the tin roof. Bo and Nora stood beneath the porch light, watching the yard grow dark and glistening. Neither spoke, but when Nora reached out and quietly closed the door behind her, it didn't sound like a shutoff. It sounded like something staying in. Part 11. A Name in the Kitchen. The rain stayed for 3 days, but nobody seemed to mind. It washed the dust from the porch rails, smoothed the ruts in the yard, left dark stripes on the windows like tears the house itself had finally let fall. The kind that come quiet, not from sorrow, but from the ache of holding too much inside for too long. Inside the kitchen, the air smelled of coffee, wet wool, and something warm that hadn't lived here in years. Eli stacked firewood by the hearth now without being asked. The girls had taken to humming, soft and tuneless, as they helped Nora dry herbs over the stove. Nothing loud, just life, simple and unstated. And Bo, he'd taken to carving, little things, hooks for coats, a peg for Nora's shawl, a holder for spoons near the hearth. He'd been a builder once, back before his wife got sick, before the corners of the house started gathering silence instead of laughter. Now slowly, piece by piece, the stillness was changing shape. It was a morning like that, mist curling over the grass, stove warm and ticking, that the moment came. He didn't notice it at first, just a sound at his elbow. He looked down. It was the youngest girl, the one with eyes too big for her face and hands that always reached for the edge of things. She stood by the table, one hand on the chipped chair where he always sat, the other clinging to the hem of her too thin dress. Bo crouched a little, slow as usual, not wanting to spook her. She looked at him a long while, as if measuring something inside herself. Then, in a voice hardly more than breath, she said, "Mr. Carter." "Papa." The word cracked through the quiet like a branch under snow. He didn't answer, couldn't. His mouth opened slightly, but nothing came out, not even air. From the stove, Nora turned, apron dusted with flour, face unreadable. She didn't say a word either, didn't correct the girl, didn't shift her gaze, just watched him. And for one long, trembling heartbeat, it wasn't just the child waiting, it was all of them. Waiting to see if he'd flinch, waiting to see if he'd leave. Bo didn't leave. He just reached out, steady as ever, and set one rough hand gently on the girl's shoulder. That was it. Not a claim, not a promise, just the touch of a man who'd been handed something fragile and held it like it mattered. That afternoon, with no ceremony and no words, he took a nail and small hammer and fixed a second hook beside his own in the kitchen. It was too low for a coat, too small for tools, but just right for a pink scarf with faded stitching. That night, when the fire burned low and the wind outside whispered over soaked earth, Nora walked past him on the way to bank the coals. She didn't stop, just let her hand trail lightly across his shoulder as she passed, and that, somehow, was more than enough. Part 12. The porch. With a name, the ground softened after the rain. Grass poked green through the churned dirt, and the horses moved slower, hooves sinking half an inch deeper than usual. The whole land seemed quieter somehow, like even the wind had paused to listen. That morning, Bo Carter stepped out onto the porch with his coffee. He still poured 2 cups, had done so for years. It used to be a ritual for memory. Now it felt less like remembering and more like making room. The house had changed, though not by anything loud. A second chair had found its way beside his. A blanket, threadbare but clean, was folded neatly across its back. A pair of boots sat beneath it, small and scuffed from play. Someone had tied a ribbon to the porch rail. Just a strip of cloth with uneven knots. It flapped now in the breeze like it was keeping watch. Bo stood still for a long while. Then he reached for his knife. Not the big one he used on brush or rope, the small one. Pocket-worn and bone-handled, the same one he'd once carved his initials into the barn door with, back when his name felt like the only thing he had to offer. He knelt by the porch post, where the wood still held the gouge marks from when his son had learned to tie his boots there, dragging heels against it in frustration. With slow, careful strokes, Bo carved just 2 words, Whitlow, Carter, nothing more. No initials, no first names, just a hyphen, plain and quiet as morning. He sat back on his heels when it was done, wiped the dust from the grooves and nodded once to himself. From inside, Eli came to the doorway, didn't speak, just watched. And then he stepped outside and sat beside Bo, not saying a thing. A moment later, the little girl wandered out too, dragging a blanket. She plopped beside Eli like she'd been doing it her whole life. And when Nora finally appeared, flowers still on her sleeve, one hand rubbing the tiredness from her neck, she paused at the door, saw the name carved there. She didn't ask why, didn't smile. But she stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and placed her hand flat over the carving, then turned and went back inside. By week's end, folks in Dry Creek had taken notice, not of the name, not directly. But someone mentioned in the trading post, "You been by Carter's place lately? Heard the Whitlow kids are there." Someone else said, "Ain't that the porch with the laughing little girl?" And after that, the house that had once been known only for its silence became known for that sound, a laugh like a creek gurgling through willow roots, like a tin pail swinging beside a bare foot, like the first good day after too many bad ones. From then on, they simply called it the place with the laughing little girl. Part 13, The Man with the Broken Plow. The seasons in Dry Creek didn't change with fanfare. They leaned in slowly, first in the way the air held longer on the skin, then in how the mornings tasted more like brass than dust. Bo Carter noticed it first in the soil. It held firmer under his boots, now like it was finally done mourning the weight of too many hard years. The wind no longer bit so sharply at the window panes, and the firewood stack lasted just a bit longer than before. One morning, a wagon creaked into view, half a wheel loose, a bent plow lashed to the back with worn leather straps. The man leading it looked like he'd been carved from the same country as Bo, weather creased, jaw tight from living too long on the edge of worn-out hope. He stopped at the fence and gave a polite nod, like a man not used to asking but still knowing when to try. "Name's Caleb," he said. "I heard you might know how to fix iron that's gone stubborn." Bo didn't say much, just looked at the plow, then at the man's hands, raw and cracked but steady. "Bring it round back," Bo said. Eli was already near the barn, pretending not to listen but inching closer with each word. Bo gave him a look, then tilted his head toward the forge. That's all it took. They worked without much talk. Bo showed him how to brace the shaft and angle the file. Eli's hands were clumsy at first, but they learned, just like they had with the saw, with the hay, with the horsebrush. Caleb watched for a while, then sat back on a nearby stump and let the quiet do the talking. When it was done, and the plow edge gleamed dull silver under soot and sweat, the man shook Bo's hand, strong and grateful. He turned to Eli last, handing him a sack of something wrapped tight in oilcloth. "Seeds," he said. "Spring's coming. Thought maybe you'd like to get ahead of it." Eli took it with two hands as if it weighed more than iron. Inside, Bo found Nora wiping the counter, the sleeves of her dress damp with rinse water. When Eli stepped in and placed the sack on the table, she paused. No questions, no fuss, just a slow exhale through her nose. Later that evening, when the light was just a whisper on the horizon and the sky had softened into a wash of pale gold and blue, Nora stepped outside with a spade. She knelt near the kitchen window in a patch of dirt no one had paid much mind to before, and she dug. 3 shallow furrows, careful, deliberate, like they weren't just holes, but promises. One by one, she dropped seeds into the earth, then covered them, smoothed the soil with her palm. Bo watched from the porch, didn't move, didn't ask, but when she stood, her hands brown with dirt, and turned toward him, there was something in her eyes, something softer than weariness, but stronger than hope. She didn't say why she planted them, didn't need to. The land would remember, and maybe, just maybe, something would grow, where once there'd only been silence. Part 14, Coffee and Embroidered Cloth. Sunrise came soft that morning, not in a blaze, not in a rush, but in slow warmth, like the hush that follows an old hymn, the kind of morning you don't talk over, you just live inside it. Bo Carter lit the fire. Early, though, he barely needed to anymore. Spring had already brushed the corners of Dry Creek with green, and the wind carried more bird song than dust. Still, he moved the same way he always did, measured without hurry. He set the kettle over the flame, just like always, pulled down the tin cups from the hook, just like always. Only this time he reached for the second one without looking. No pause, no second thought. It had become a habit again. The good kind, the kind built from presence instead of absence. He poured 2 cups and walked them to the porch. One he kept in his hand, the other he set down across from him on the small table with the worn knot in the wood grain. The one his wife used to sit beside, now it held someone else's weight. Nora stepped out a moment later, her shawl barely clinging to her shoulders. Her hair was half pinned, the rest soft with sleep. She held something small in her hands, cloth wrapped around itself like a letter never meant to be sent. She didn't say anything at first, just walked to where he sat, looked at the cup, then at him, and she tied it. A new piece of embroidered cloth, deep blue with red stitching in a pattern that reminded Bo of wind swirling through canyon rock. Wrapped gently around the base of his cup, it was small, unspoken, like most of her gifts. But it sat there like a seal, a mark, a whisper between them. They didn't toast, didn't exchange vows, didn't need to. They just sat, 2 cups steaming, the porch warm under their feet, the air thick with the scent of mesquite and tilled earth. Behind them, the 3 children still slept. The dog, Whiskey, snored beside the fire. The seeds in the kitchen patch were just beginning to nudge upward through the soil, quiet and alive. And in that silence, rich, human, whole, Nobody felt like a stranger anymore. Bo leaned back, took a long, steady sip, and let the warmth settle in. Not just the coffee, but the knowing that this, whatever this was, had stayed. Not because he'd asked it to, but because it wanted to. Because sometimes in a town like Dry Creek, in a world like theirs, all it took was a little space made ready, a door left open, and someone willing to come through it. And in the quiet of that porch, with coffee gone warm and a breeze carrying the scent of earth and mesquite, there were no more locked doors. Not in the barn. Not in him. Sometimes healing doesn't ride in with thunder. It walks up slow on tired feet with children in tow and stays long enough to be trusted. And when it does, a man learns that maybe he wasn't meant to be alone all this time. If a moment in this story stirred something in you, a memory, a silence, a scar still mending, I'd be honored if you shared it down below. Not for the noise, just to remind someone else watching that they're not the only one still learning how to stay.